In this section, we're going to look at complex numbers. Complex numbers include regular numbers and something called imaginary or lateral numbers. Negative numbers do not have square roots in the real number system. A larger number system that contains the real number system is designed so that negative numbers have square roots. This system is called the complex number system. It will allow us to solve equations like x squared plus 1 equals 0. The number I is a unique number for which I squared equals negative 1. This is a pretty important concept to remember right here. The definition is the square root of a negative number is as follows. If you take the square root of negative p, this is equal to the square root of negative 1 times p, or we can say this equals plus or minus I root p. Or we can say it's equal to the square root of p times plus or minus I. This last example here is usually considered poor notation in some situations. It's usually better to list the complex factors before the radicals. So we can see a pattern, hopefully, repeat at the fourth power of I. In this example, we have I to the 0 is 1, and that's true for anything raised to the 0 power. But I raised to the first power is equal to the square root of negative 1. And then we have I squared. Notice that this takes what we had in the first example, I to the first power, and it multiplies it by itself. Whenever you multiply two radicals with the same identical radicand, you get the radicand out without the radical there. And then for I to the third, we have 1, 2, 3 radicals multiplied together with a negative 1 inside. Notice that this gives us negative I. And lastly, we have I to the fourth. I to the fourth, once again, is the square root of negative 1 multiplied to itself 4 times, and we get 1 out. See how I to the 0 and I to the fourth are equivalent. The pattern repeats at the fourth exponent. We now need to try two examples, and we need to express them in terms of I. So I'm going to take this square root of negative 1 times 9 and write it that way. And then remember that the square root of negative 1 is equal to I. Now remember, that's because I squared equals negative 1. If we were to take the square root of both sides, we'd have plus or minus I equals the square root of negative 1. So we can take out a 9 as 3 and an I. And don't forget that plus or minus in front. Similarly, we have a negative on the outside. We have the square root of negative 1 times 2 times 5 squared. Notice that the 5 squared can come out evenly. The 2 is prime and must stay in, and the negative 1 can come out as a plus or minus I. So we have negative on the outside, and then we need to place stuff in the outside of the radical. So we'll have negative plus or minus 5I root 2. Now I can rewrite this as a negative times a positive is a negative, and a negative times a negative is a positive. So we'll just say minus plus 5I root 2.